Hey guys, Pastor Tim here. Hope you're ready for another video from our youth group at Lighthouse Baptist Church. If this is your first time watching a video or you're trying to catch up on a missed lesson, we hope that this video is a blessing to you and helps you grow in your relationship with Jesus Christ.
All right, so let's read verse 3. We're going to read verse 1 to 16, but let's just read verse 3 as our main text, I guess you would say. And it says, "But I would have you know that the head of every man is Christ, and the head of the woman is the man, and the head of Christ is God." All right, so when he's speaking of head, he's not talking about the physical head, but he's talking about headship or authority or leadership. So title of your lesson, you guys see in your notes, is order. Okay, we're going to talk about some things that the Corinthian church was struggling with when it came to the order that God wants to see in the church. But if you couldn't get it from that verse already, when we get into the rest of the passage, you can see how this could be a passage that people can very easily lose sight of what is the true issue Paul is trying to get to that the church of Corinth was struggling with. But let me first start with like a little illustration. All right? How many guys, I'm not saying do you enjoy it, but how many guys have eaten at a McDonald's before? Okay, all right, put your hands down. So when you go to McDonald's, you have people that are working there, okay? But if there seems to be a problem, okay, there's hair in your food or something, or just the service was terrible, who is it that you would want to speak to? All right, Amethyst? The manager. Hey, can I speak to your manager? Why do you want to speak to the manager? Why is that the specific person you would want to bring that problem up to? Amethyst. Because they're in charge. All right, you understand, guys, just listen up because we're going to go through this kind of quickly, but you understand that in a place even like McDonald's, there is a structure. There is an order that should be there, and many of us have probably been to a McDonald's where there wasn't much structure or order there, and it's because these things have been kind of falling apart. But even a fast food restaurant, you understand that it's not going to operate as it should if there isn't structure or order, okay? Not everyone can be the line cook, right? Because someone has to run the cash register. Not everyone can be a front worker where they just run the cash register and make sure the front of house is clean and so forth, okay? And not everyone can be the manager. Why? Because then who's going to make sure things are actually being performed? Yeah, a manager makes sure that things are being done correctly and effectively, but if the whole restaurant was full of nothing but managers, then who's actually doing the things? You guys follow? So even if a place like McDonald's has to run on some form of structure and have some order of things from manager to co-manager or assistant manager to the workers and so forth, how much more so does the church of God need that same structure? Okay, and that's kind of what Paul is coming into here, all right, is that God has ordained a order to how the church is supposed to function. And that means that certain people are supposed to have certain positions and certain people are not. And what I want you to first understand, I think I have your verse down there, 1 Corinthians 14:33, and that is simply the verse that says that God is not the author of confusion, okay? And God is not a God of confusion. He's a God of order. And he does not want to see his church run in a confusing or a just puzzling manner. Nobody should come into a church and be puzzled by what's going on or what they're seeing there. You guys follow? And that's what's starting to happen here at the church of Corinth, is Paul's addressing the issue that is bringing confusion to those who are on the outside looking in, wondering why is this happening the way it's happening in this church, and it's bringing a bad testimony upon the church there, and Paul says it ought not be so. And he's actually saying this wouldn't be a problem if you were to follow the order God has ordained. And yes, the order we're talking about, if you didn't get it from verse 3, is about the man, or Christ is the head of the man, and we know Christ is the head of the church, and the man is the head of the woman, and so forth. And yes, we're talking about the head of the church should be men, all right? The head of the household, and we're going to go to these passages as well, is also the man, okay? Modern society, they bulk against this. They think it ought not be so, and we'll get into some of that as we go on, but understand right from the get-go, God's ordained order for how these things should operate in both the church and in the home is for the man to be the head of the house and the church. Yes, we understand Christ is the head of the church, but there are passages like 1 Timothy 2, 11, 14, we have that down in your notes there, that make it very clear that the head of the body of Christ and the church itself is the pastor. We understand that. And the pastor is a man. How many guys understand there's women pastors out there today, though, Pastor Tim? Yes, there are women pastors out there, but that does not mean that they are correct. All right? 1 Timothy 2, 11 through 14 talks about how women are not to have spiritual authority over men. Okay? It's that same passage that a lot of people balk at as well, that talks about women being silent in the church, and that's a whole other lesson for another time. But what is very clearly seen is that when it comes to public speaking, public prayer, which women are allowed to do, it is not to be in a way that it's over men in the church. All right? That's why we allow women to teach kids here at Lighthouse. That's why we allow women speakers to come in for women's conferences and so forth. But we see in God's word that when it comes to the church as a whole, where men are present, when it comes to men's conferences, when it comes to church services in general, where the whole populace, men and women, are present at the church, that it is a man who's to be the head of that, leading the service, being the pastor, the shepherd, that's what pastor means, of the congregation. You guys follow me there? And then even more so when you get into the qualifications of a pastor, okay? It's all very masculine. How do we know that? Because one of the qualifications right from the get-go is that a pastor or an elder, as the Bible says, must be the husband of one wife, okay? It definitely doesn't mean that it has to be the wife of one wife, because we know that's definitely not something God's allowing in the church. And therefore, it's obviously understood that the pastor, the elder, whatever a church might want to refer to their lead shepherd as, is to be a man. All right, so you guys got that? The ordained order God had in both house and home. Ephesians chapter 5, 22 to 33, those are the verses that you hear many times at weddings and so forth, and talked about in any sort of marriage counseling, saying, wives, submit unto your husband. Men, you are to love your wives as Christ loved the what? Church. See that picture between church and family as, again, very easily I understand how people can see that and think like it's speaking of the inferiority of women and so forth. But understand, it's not about status, it's about responsibility, and it is about order. And we're going to see in our passage today that there is a reason. God gives a reason why he has it as such, and it's quite simply has to do with creation. Who was created first? Adam. And who was created from Adam? Eve. Okay? And you're going to have people that are going to balk at it, people that want to go with what society puts forth today, and they may have their good reasons for that, and their reasons may sound and just. But at the end of the day, guys, as Bible-believing Christians, do we follow man's philosophy or God's word? God's word. Okay? And there is joy, there is order, and there is productivity. There's growth that is found in a church that follows the order that God has given. Okay? I want to put I know I've spent a lot of time on all that, and we're getting to the passage here in just a moment, but I want to put that all out front, because this is what Paul's facing. This is the order that he puts forth, because we're going to get into a passage that is going to seem like, what does this have to do with what? Because it's really going to talk about a lot about hair, okay? About long hair, short hair, and so forth. And you'll see when we get into the passage, and it could very easily make you start to lose track of what the real issue is. On one side, someone's going to lose track and think like, oh, this is wrong because it's saying that women are inferior to men and so forth. And on the other side, people are solely focusing on, well, this is why guys can't have long hair and only women should have long hair. And it's like, well, what we're looking at right now, yes, that's being spoken, that's what's being talked about. But really what Paul's getting at is that there is a bucking of the reins, so to speak. The church has thrown off and have deviated from the order God has given, and it's causing problems in the church. And it does have to deal with this certain thing when it comes to head coverings and hair, but really it's about order that God desires and ordained in the church. So let's get into the passage. It's a long introduction, and we'll get into it real quick. It says, "Be ye followers of me, even as I also am of Christ. Now I praise you, brethren, that you remembered me in all things, and keep the ordinances as I delivered them to you. But," and this is the verse we already read, he puts forward the importance of order right away, "but I would have you know that the head of every man is Christ, and the head of every woman is the man, and the head of Christ is God." Headship and submission are needed for order and success. That's why it's important. Okay? God is the head of Christ. Christ is the head of the man. Man is the head of the woman. And we're going to get into the whole God and Christ thing here towards the end. How many of you guys have ever heard the saying, too many chefs in the kitchen? Okay? What does that mean, Nevaeh? You don't know? Grace.
There are too many people doing one thing. We need help elsewhere.
It's not just that, but you're not far off. Gage.
We all prefer it done a certain way, and because of that, they all keep seasoning it differently, and you get this.
Yeah, and you get a terrible product. All right, you can't have too many people trying to dictate how something is supposed to operate, how something's supposed to go. Okay, and that's why headship and submission is very important. All right, so what's the problem happening here with the Church of Corinth? Let's go on to verse 4. Every man praying or prophesying, and he's talking about public praying, public prophesying, which is prophesying is not, they're not telling the future, divining what's going to come, reading tea leaves and so forth. It's talking about just preaching, proclaiming the word. So every man praying or prophesying, having his head covered, dishonoreth his head. But every woman that prayeth or prophesieth with her head uncovered, dishonoreth her head, for that is even all, For every woman that prayeth or prophesieth with her head uncovered, dishonoreth her head, for that is even all one as if she were shaven, as if she had a shaven head. For if the woman were not covered, let her also be shorn. But if it be a shame for a woman to be shorn or shaven, let her be covered. All right. Everyone look up here really quick. Okay. Paul is addressing the church at Corinth, and he's addressing something or referring to something that is very particular to their culture at this time. Okay. Now, he begins by saying when a man prays or preaches, it's a shame if he has his head covered. And then he goes on saying when a woman prays or preaches, she should have her head covered. Okay? Now, is it saying that a woman should never pray or preach in the church? Now, understand when I say preach, I'm not talking about the role of a pastor. I'm talking about proclaiming the word. Okay? We have women that preach in Lighthouse all the time, teaching classes, I'm pretty sure they're going to have a lady proclaiming the word at the next, ladies' evening and so forth. So yes, don't get confused. Think like, oh, women aren't allowed to do that. No, he's saying when they do that, they have to have their head covered. Now, here's where it's going to get confusing. This is not a mandate across the board that Paul is saying here that women should wear hats. You guys follow? Because it's talking about a head covering. Now, we do understand in the context, we'll get into it a little bit, we saw a little bit already talking about shaved heads and so forth, that a woman's covering could also be her long hair. All right, but what I want you guys to understand, this is a cultural thing that Paul is referencing in this passage. It's not a mandate saying that we need to wear hats, or ladies that you need to wear hats. And I've known churches that still observe things like this even today, and some people take it to extremes in some cases, Sunday hats and all. If you all watched the Kentucky Derby this last week. But anyway, it's not a mandate that you guys have to wear hats, and it's not a mandate that you have to have your hair a certain length. Paul is addressing a problem that's happening in church at Corinth culturally. Okay, but there is a bigger picture here. So let me explain what's the big deal about a woman not having a head cover in the church of Corinth at this time. Okay, you guys follow? All right, so this is not a mandate across the board that believing women around the world should wear hats today. No, hats today are more of a fashion statement, a covering. Micah?
When it says dishonor his head.
I'll get there in a second. All right. Neither is it signifying the inferiority of women to men. We already talked about it ad nauseum already. Here's the point of it all, is submission to God-given order and chain of command. Because culturally, a woman at this time in the Church of Corinth, all right, especially a believing woman, wearing a head covering signified something spiritually or culturally at that time as well, but it was a cultural thing. Culturally, the covering of the head of a believing Corinthian woman showed that she was under the authority of her husband and submissive to God's order. All right? It would be shameful if they were to have their head uncovered. And we'll get into some reason why that would be. But just know culturally at that time, a woman wearing a head covering was showing that she was under the authority of her husband. Okay? So, for a woman not to cover her head, not just while prophesying and praying in the church, but also in public at that time in that part of the country, what would that then be signifying to people around them? Like she was bucking the authority, or like she was almost living in a rebellious manner. Okay? And there's some historical, some cultural reasons why. This covering not only means a cloth, but it also can refer to a woman's hair length, okay? We'll get to verse 15 later on when it talks about, a woman's hair is her glory and so forth. But this was an outward indication of a heart attitude of submission to God and his established authority. An uncovered or shaved head, and Paul references that, like, if a woman was to have her head uncovered, she might as well just shave it. There's a reason he says that, okay? An uncovered or shaved head of a woman could mean several things. Now, to the Jews, it could mean one of two things. One, and I have the verses there, Deuteronomy and Numbers. The first one, it could mean that this woman is in mourning, all right? That would be very confusing if someone was to come into your church and think that somebody's mourning for some reason when nobody's dead, okay? So people would shave their head for that reason. We've seen that in the Bible as well in the Old Testament. Another reason, and this is why it could probably bring even more confusion, now this is for Jewish believers, is a woman would have her head shaved in the book of Numbers if she was caught and guilty of adultery. Okay? If they were guilty of adultery, they would shave their head. All right? They would have their head uncovered. So culturally speaking, if somebody was to come into the church and see a woman praying or teaching other people in the church and have her head uncovered, can you guys start to see why it would start to bring confusion to anybody? Like, what's going on in this? Like, what does she do? All right? What is she? Is she rebelling against her husband? Is she guilty of this or that? But even more so, in the Corinthian culture at that time, the women who usually had their head uncovered or who shaved their heads were most likely the temple prostitutes. We talked about that earlier in our study of the book of Corinthians. A lot of the temple prostitutes at that time, through the pagan worship that they did in that part of the country, customarily had either shaven heads, and they definitely did not have their heads covered. So ultimately, a woman who refused to wear a covering in that culture was refusing to submit to God's order. Okay, so what's the problem? Women were either usurping the roles of men that the men were supposed to have in the church. That's one problem we could see in this, all right? They're bucking the authority that man's supposed to have. They're having their heads uncovered, and they may be usurping the authority a man should have. Or the men were not stepping up. Either case, both is shameful. Both is bucking God's order. Both brings confusion to the church. All right, guys, it should be a shameful thing if you are allowing your future wife or allowing women in the church to have to step up and take the authority and the responsibility. Right, Greg? All right, sit up. Take the authority, take the responsibility that you should have as the husband, the head of the house, and that you should have as a man in your church. You guys follow that? There are cases, and we even see it in the Old Testament as well, where, men were not stepping up, and God has to call upon a woman to step up and have that authority. You think of the judge, Deborah, back in the Old Testament. That's a shame. But women as well, understanding that God has set a certain order, you should not be seeking to usurp the role that a man should have in the house and in the church. I'm not saying you just sit idly by if they're not taking up their responsibility, but it is a desire, because we're human beings, to want to have the prominence, to want to have authority, and that ought not to be the case in the house and in the church. You guys follow? That's one of the things that God even said when man fell in the Garden of Eden. Part of the curse was that woman would seek to have power over her husband. You would not seek your own, not seek the family, but seek your own. Verse 4. Another problem that this leads to is that it affects the church's testimony. All right? People come in, are confused. Why is this woman, taking the authority that a man's supposed to have? Why does this woman not have her head covered? Is she in rebellion to the church? Why aren't the men stepping up? What is this person guilty of? Are they an adulterer? Are they one of the temple You guys see how this brings confusion? It's ruining the testimony of the church. Verse 4. Go back to verse 4. Micah kind of was alluding to this. He says, every man praying or prophesying, having his head covered, dishonoreth his head. Now, when he first talks about having his head covered, he's talking about what? He's talking about his noggin. Okay? But the second time he mentions having his head covered or dishonoring his head, he's not talking about like his head looks ugly all of a sudden, depending on what kind of hat he put on, I guess. But it's more referring to he dishonoreth his position he should have, meaning it's a shame. How many guys, we talked about too many chefs in the kitchen, how many guys have ever heard someone jokingly say, who wears the pants? Okay? Usually it's a joke. Okay? Usually a man will defer to his wife, hey, where do you want to eat? All right, I'll go where you want to eat and so forth and stuff like that. That's harmless, all right? And usually people joke around, oh, I see who wears the pants here and this, whatever, okay? But it is not a joke if it's actually true when it comes to the running of the household, all right? Who wears the pants? It is a shame for a man not to fulfill the role or duty he has as the head of the house and the church. Okay, it dishonoreth his head. All right, let's continue reading, and we'll continue on here. Verse 8, for the man is not of the woman, but the woman of the man, referring to creation. Why this headship even exists is because God created man first and woman from the man. Neither was the man created for the woman, but the woman for the man. Why did God create Eve? Because it was not good for man to be alone, and he wanted to make for him a helpmeet. Verse 10, for this cause ought the woman to have power on her head because of the angels. Nevertheless, neither is the man without the woman. So he's like, all right, even though I'm defining these different roles, and guys, understand, God has created both man and woman. There's not any others. There's just those two, in case there's any confusion about that. He's created man and woman differently and with different roles. Okay? That's not talking about women are inferior or men are superior. It's not talking about one is there's some sort of inequality there. No. There is equality, and we'll talk about that in a second, but there is still different distinct roles given unto each. Verse 11, nevertheless, neither is the man without the woman, neither the woman without the man in the Lord. For as the woman is of the man, even so is the man also by the woman, but all things of God. What that's talking about is, yes, even though there's distinct roles, man and woman, husband and wife, they're still interdependent to each other. All right? I've only been married for not even 2 years yet, and I can tell you right now, I would not be the man I am even today if it wasn't for Miss Christine. All right? I'm pretty sure. All right, I'm not doing that for points. This is truth, okay? But, and I'm sure many of your parents would say the same thing. Any healthy, godly relationship, that is very true. Okay? We've talked about this many times. Human beings naturally are interdependent beings, and that's much the same in the church and in the house. But there's still distinct roles, and there's still an order that has to be maintained. If all that existed in the McDonald's was the manager, nothing would get done. If all that existed in the McDonald's was the workers or the fry cooks, things could go quickly fall into disarray. They run out of supplies because things aren't being ordered and so forth. Yes, they're different distinct roles, but they're still interdependent on each other. You guys see how there's still value in that? Where did I leave? 13, judge ye in yourselves, is it comely that a woman pray unto God uncovered? So he's referring to this cultural thing again. Doth not even nature itself teach you that if a man have long hair, it is a shame unto him, but if a woman have long hair, it is a glory to her, for her hair is given her for a covering. All right, so this is where, I'm not saying it's wrong, but sometimes people really just hunker down on this point, talking about this is why guys should only have short hair and girls should not have short hair, and you can take of it as you will. Remember, this is still referring to just things that were cultural at that time, all right? But it does shed light on what is a truism. And what I mean by that is all throughout time, okay, in human society, I believe that people understood that, hey, women just have long hair. And they take a second look when they notice that, oh, that guy has long hair. I'm not saying you should judge them and be like, shame on them, but it catches your eye, right? When you vice versa, when you see a woman that has a shaved head, it catches your eye. It's just a natural thing that is understood that one has short hair, one has long hair. It's not a mandate. It's not saying that you should strictly judge and say that person's living in rebellion and sin, because that was a cultural thing at this time. Verse 16, but if any man seem to be contentious, like he has a problem with this, we have no such custom, neither the churches of God. If he has a problem with this, he needs to just understand that, hey, God has ordained this order. All right, so really quickly, I'm going to end talking about this. God has created man and woman distinctly different from one another in many ways, okay? Physically, biologically, and obviously distinct different roles. But what we need to understand is that this is an absolute truth created by God, okay? Head of the house, head of the church, man over the woman. Man is to be the head of the woman in both home and church, okay? Now, the arguments you'll see back at this is, well, that's just a social construct. That's just something that man is, the hierarchy, the patriarchy, whatever they make the man to be. That's just something that they put forth, and that's why we follow that. Or some other people who are for it will say things like, well, that's understandable because of the contrasting temperament between men and women. Obviously, men should be the leaders. Guys, I've seen more men unstable emotionally and in their temperament in some cases that a woman would probably better fit in that role. At the end of the day, whatever your argument may be, we accept this order because it is what God has ordained. Okay? Whatever truth may be in those two arguments. A different role does not imply inequality or inferiority. All right, we're running out of time, so I'll just going to go through this quickly. He said in verse 3 that that Christ is the head of the man is the head of the woman, and that God is the head, and referring to God the Father, is the head of Christ. Okay? This is how we know when he's likening these two pictures, man is the head of the woman, the Father is the head of the Son. This is how we know there is distinct roles, but not inequality. All right? Because we know in the Trinity, it is God made in what? 3 persons. They're co-equal. They're all 100%. They're all divinely God. All right? But what do you mean Christ is the head of, or God is the head of Christ? What it's referring to is that each part of the Trinity has a distinct role. Okay? Easy example to understand is when Christ was in the Garden of Gethsemane and he prayed unto who? The Father, and he said, whose will be done? All right? But we also understand he is submitting to the will of the Father, but if Christ is God, is he inferior to the Father? No. I know the Trinity can be a heady thing to understand, but just understand there's distinct roles, but it's still equal in value. Was just man created in the image of God? No. Man and woman. Genesis, I have in your notes there, Genesis 1:26. Both of them were created in the image of God. Both of them have the same value and worth in the eyes of God. But there are distinct roles. The man is the head of the house, all right, because the woman is made from man. All right? The woman is the helpmeet, but they're both interdependent on one another. All right? We're running out of time. I know I spoke at a fast pace there. If you guys have any questions about that actually right now. Okay. If you do have any questions about that later on, by all means, you come up, talk to me or Miss Christine. We'll gladly try to answer that. I just don't want you guys to get confused when somebody may bring up a passage like this, or you may read it back in the future during your own Bible study, and you're like, why are we talking about hair so much, okay? There's a reason Paul was bringing it up, and it has to go all the way back to God has ordained order so that the house and the church can function as he sees best.